Hello, this is the second video in a rather, I want to say for now, short nuanced series on understanding agential systems. And there might have been some things I didn't go over in too much detail in the last video, but fortunately, it was under an hour long. I don't want these videos to drag on too long, but I think that for those of you who want to get the most out of this video and the video coming after this, please watch the previous video, which I'll have in the video description to this video, titled as Consciousness as Embodiment, which should provide a nice comprehensive overview on agential systems. It doesn't talk about everything there in terms of all the details regarding agential systems, although I did put links in that video, in the video description of that video, to go more into the details of non-classical logic systems associated with the reasoning capacities of agential systems, as opposed to the capacities of classical computer systems that we're used to, in which I did some little comparison and contrast in that video. But now I want to talk about something a bit more interesting, and this is going to get into the woods of, I suppose, maybe philosophy and theology a little bit, although maybe that is contentious. I'm not going to make any claims here about super solid science, but I want to talk more about some nuances that in regards to my own work has to do with how agents engage with each other, also what I like to call as interagent dynamics. So before we get into what I would like to call the phenomenal capacity for agents to optimally engage with each other, which I like to call what God is, considering that this content is it could be a little, I don't know how contentious this the points that I make in this video are going to be, but I want to before we get into the whole God part of this, I want to first talk about this capacity of fundamentally how agents can coordinate and rather cooperate with each other optimally to preserve the viability of their agency on the one hand, and different types of agents, considering, we consider what we refer to agents now largely as biological organisms, going from single cell organisms to multicellular organisms, which we considered in the video on that I recorded previously. We consider multicellular organisms as multi-agent systems. And phenomenally, the way our entire anatomy works and how we optimize integrity is from the bottom up. Cells affiliated with each important subsystem of our anatomical being are working together to sustain each integral subsystem. So that means that each cell is cooperating with one another on some level, which like I said, from the bottom up, we're not considering this from the top down quite yet. But even when we consider it top down, involving our decision making and executive functioning capacities, we still have networks of cells cooperating together to explore to navigate space. And basically we talked about perceptions, actions, and priors, which is more complex in terms of considering decision-making capacities from the top down when we consider executive functioning, which has to do with neural networks in our brains, neural and glial cellular networks. From the bottom up, we can consider the facilitation of metabolism, which optimizes capacity to regulate each of the integral subsystems that optimizes executive functioning capacity from the top down, or contentiously optimizes our decision-making faculties. Now, for some people, what we eat does have a big impact on our behavior in terms of how we evaluate decisions and act on those decisions. But this capacity relies on the integrated capabilities of neural and glial cellular networks in our central nervous system, where they have to cooperate together to facilitate our capacity of thought and decision making, and how we act upon the world around us, and how we develop a history of referring to how we perceive and act on the world around us. So considering how we're capable of reflecting on and storing memories of our own experiences is in due result of the capabilities of these clusters of networks of neural and glial cells cooperating together. And from this phenomenal capacity, we can extend from just one person having this capacity of an executive functioning dynamic to how multiple people, groups of people, cooperate together. We have this interaction of multi-agent systems, right, where we consider humans to be the lower bound of general intelligence that currently exists. Not considering this whole debate on artificial general intelligence systems and when that's going to happen. But that's not the point of this video. So, what's interesting about how multi-agent systems can engage with each other is how they acknowledge the existence of one another and coordinate in likewise fashion. How each of us as multi-agent systems cooperates, rather communicates with other agents and recognizes the autonomy of other like-minded agents. We as multi-agent systems, these lower bound general intelligence systems, how we optimize our fitness, while at the same time this capacity to optimize fitness relies on how we diplomatically engage with one another to a point where we are in a scenario where we have to optimize each other's fitness to some degree. We might not fully relate to other people than ourselves, But at some point, in order for us to coexist, we have to have this capacity to recognize that someone is a lot like us. There are other humans other than myself and yourself. And this capacity for we as humans to sufficiently cooperate in groups has led to what now exists as modern civilization and the advents of the current technologies that exist, in which we extend our own capabilities from hunter-gatherer groups to now we have these cohesive technological civilizations which have their problems. But isn't it quite astounding that we have worked together at some sufficient capacity? We have recognized one another's autonomy. We recognize that working together could get us as far as we have. To manipulate information, to be able to take this capacity to develop tools, which humans are not the only organisms that are capable of tool use, but our capacity to utilize tools and the sophistication in which we have been able to utilize and develop language systems separates us from all other life on Earth. And this capacity for generational, iterative transference of understandings from one generation to another, in not really just trial and error of how we explore our environment, how we perceive and act on our environment, but how we develop that history through generational iterations, through generations of human history, as going from the many ages of humanity, from the Stone Age to now the modern era. This capacity to pass on information makes humans quite unique in terms of being able to take sensations and utilize those sensations as information that we generalize as knowledge, or generalize, what I like to call in my work as generalized knowledge. That we take this information that seems to be consistent in how we manipulate tools and furthermore develop different technologies, and furthermore develop the capacities of language and languages we use. Of course, there's so many languages in which humans engage with each other in, but there's proto-languages that came before the more common languages that we're familiar with. Now, again, this is uniquely human. That's not to say that other agents or other lesser agents that aren't humans, that don't have this lower bound general intelligence capacity as we know it, since we are the only general intelligent organisms that currently exist that we know of in the universe and on our planet. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other organisms that have a capacity of some level of self-awareness and the capacity for tool use or metacognitive capacities. There's other organisms that are capable of this, but none of these organisms have reached this capacity to develop sufficient language structure systems in which we're able to keep track of how we explore our environment collectively together, generalize that as information, and we take that information, which stands to consistency and validity over time, which becomes generalized knowledge. This currently is uniquely human. That's not to say that given the right conditions, that other life on Earth could certainly develop such capacities. I mean, if we consider ravens, give them maybe another 300 or 600 million years, maybe ravens would be more like humans. Perhaps even so, also orcas, dolphins, chimpanzees, maybe even baboons. Although some of these species have endangered populations, so that's also up for contention. Now, okay, this is interesting. Let's get back to this idea of preserving viability. And I will add in a couple papers in the video. I did not add papers to the last video. I figured I'd add some videos to elaborate on some interesting content. But I'll add some papers here that could elaborate more on the points I'm making. But I think there's something interesting about not only this phenomenal aspect of how agents cooperate and how that cooperation leads to this sufficient optimality to not only preserve our autonomy and leverage our own fitness as individual agents, but by recognizing that there are other agents within the environment we are bound to that exist among us, and diplomatically engaging with other agents envelops some sense of security that our agency is maintained over time because we recognize other agencies other than our own. Even lesser agents that aren't human, which I think contentiously a lot of people, like a lot of humans, just act obliviously towards the environment. And I think that's a problem where we are just not good at symbiosis with everything else that exists within the encompassing biosphere. The biosphere representing the environment in which all agents as biological organisms exist in. But yet all these agents, or many of them rather, you can say that they all have their own functional roles. I'm not going to go over functional roles of all these agents like plants and fungi and all that stuff. But a lot of lesser agents provide a capacity for us to exist within the environment we are bound to, that we exist in. Yet many of us are oblivious to that. Not all of us. But there should be more of there should be more of this recognizing and an assertive means to act on how we can more symbiotically coexist with all life on Earth, or all other lesser agents that aren't human, or don't have human-like capacities, even. Which is a problem. We have to think about how do we optimize ourselves as well as our ecosystem, because we are bound to this ecosystem. Now, there's a lot of contention about the impact we have on our biosphere in terms of climate dynamics, which is, I'm not going to get into that because I think that's quite contentious. And I think a lot of the problem we have, even though our activity could be threatening to lots of life and existence of rather lesser agents than us, which is problematic. We should figure out, okay, well, how do we coexist with other agents? And this capacity to recognize this, to be aware that we are part of this process of natural selection, and we are rather perhaps a second force of nature with this capacity to recognize, this capacity to somewhat cohesively engage and cooperate in groups with each other, that leads us to the technological and language sophistication we have developed, this capacity to think in abstraction because of the structural sophistication of which language has been developed, due to how we have cooperatively and collectively developed these language structures in which enabled the possibility of modern society as we know it. And this is in due part recognizing our autonomy, each other having similar, pretty much the same level of general autonomy. We're all different in terms of our own behavior as humans, but in a general sense, our means to engage and develop technology and utilize these sophisticated language structures to develop generalized knowledge is how we relate to each other. And in my point of view, the capacity to optimize this is due to this emergent capacity in which we have just sufficiently cooperated in large enough groups that relies on culture selection dynamics, right? That it relies on culture being that groups behave in a certain manner, facilitate cohesion amongst each other in a certain manner, have certain values. This capacity to utilize technology or tool use, this is a synthetic selection capacity. It's not necessarily exclusive to humans. I mean, we can look at even how insects utilize selection in a synthetic selection. How ants build anthills. How bees build beehives. Those are very simple examples. In terms of culture, this is, in a sense, uniquely human, but there are lesser agents, like baboons, dolphins, orcas, that cooperate in groups in a certain way. Think of different mammals, packs of wolves. They cooperate and value how they engage with one another. This may be more primitive understanding of culture, but this is cultural selection dynamics nonetheless, outside of human behavior. But our capacity to utilize sophisticated language structure. I also didn't mention this capacity in which we a mimetic adaptation, or how we imitate, imitation-based learning, based on generational iterations of how we pass on how we engage with the world around us. I'll also provide a link to Celia Hayes in terms of a video I found interesting on cognitive gadgets, which goes into generational transference, dynamics, imitation learning, cultural selection. I think that will provide a nice overview of what I'm getting into here. But this phenomenal capacity in which how we as humans are able to engage with one another in sufficiently large enough groups to recognize and in a sense value each other's agency, which has led to the prospects of modern society as we know it. The very the possibility that I'm recording this video is all due to how we've been able to recognize each other in terms of agency and cooperate with each other in interagent fashion. And developing ethical policies in how we ought to optimize that, how we should and shouldn't engage with each other in certain ways. What do we value in how we engage with each other? Which is emergent due to anthropomorphic dynamics of culture, which then leads me to then state, of course, also lead to rather a syntactic problem or a semantics issue when people address religion or theology. One shouldn't ask who is God, which is like asking who is mathematics, who is physics, who is biology. One should ask, for definition's sake, what is God? And if we are to consider converging aspects of different religions, such as God is good, God is compassion, God is love, God is acting in good conscience, this aligns with how we, as general intelligent agents, optimize our capacity to value and engage with one another. And this capacity to optimize and engage with one another, preserving viability of each other's agency to the best that we can, in a diplomatic fashion rather, is what I would call God. And now this definition of God really is just, there's no general form of this rather than an abstract form. Because this relies on anthropomorphic dynamics of culture in which how we engage with each other in an optimal fashion that preserves fitness, that preserves each other's agency. This is what I call the God as an emergent property of how agents engage with each other in an optimal way. I suppose perhaps this is a conjecture. I don't know if this is something we can prove necessarily mathematically and with solidity, but I will say that at least it makes sense to me in a way that perhaps this is a conjecture for an emergence framework for what God is. And I figured this would be a good way to talk about how agents engage with each other in the most optimal fashion, but also relate such a fashion to thinking about converging aspects of religion and theology. And perhaps this might be a bit of a general means of a definition, but to me, at least it makes sense. Until next time, I hope you enjoyed this video.